Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Christine Colucci, CEO of R plus M, and joining me is Edward Baldwin, Principal and our Strategy Practice Lead. We want to begin with an idea that may challenge how organizations think about growth. Sometimes a company doesn't lose a sale. They never become a serious option in the first place. They don't make the buyer shortlist. And in the case of the buyer, has already formed an opinion about who feels credible, who feels relevant, who feels enough to consider. They've already thought about this. And if you're not on the buyer shortlist, your company is not under consideration, or very likely not under consideration. I don't like to do absolutes, right? Edward and I approached this problem from two deeply connected sides of the business. Edward focuses on the market and the buyer, the commercial impact of how brands earn trust, what builds confidence before a formal buying process begins, and why some organizations make the short list while others never become serious contenders. And my work really begins inside the organization. I focus on leadership alignment and the operating environment leaders create. And when I say leadership alignment, I don't actually mean that leaders have to agree on everything. What I mean is they share a clear understanding of where the company is going, what matters most, and how decisions should be made. And those two perspectives belong together because revenue may be generated in the market, but many of the conditions that support or undermine revenue are often created inside the business. So today, Edward's going to take us outside the organization and talk to us about how buyers begin building their short list long before our formal sales process begins. And I'm going to take us inside the organization and show how leadership decisions shape the experiences and the signals those buyers receive. And together, we're going to connect those both sides to growth. Because long before a buyer purchases, they've already begun deciding who they trust. And long before that, the company has already created many of the conditions influencing the decision. Your company is creating those conditions. So with that, Edward, let's start with what's happening on the buyer side before an organization even knows the buyer exists.
Absolutely. Thanks, Christine. Yeah, this is a key idea inside and outside the business because that gap between, when the buyer starts shaping beliefs and when the company kind of becomes aware of them is where really a lot of opportunity is won or lost. And, as Christine said, in short, this buying is really, it begins well before anybody actually raises their hand. Um, in our work, this idea that the buying journey is starting earlier, we're kind of harping on this today because it really is a pretty widespread blind spot that we see with B2B companies we work with. By the time a prospect is visiting your website and downloading something or reaching out to sales, doing these things that to us signal buying intent or show us that they are an active buyer, they're really a lot further along in their decision making than the sales funnel would have us believe. Because before that formal buying process begins, there is activity. A buyer may have heard of your name from a peer. They may have seen one of your executives speak or come across some thought leadership that you've published. They might have read an article or a review, in a trade pub. Any number of places, all places we have a very difficult time seeing and tracking because it's non-linear. And no single interaction is going to make their decision or cement anything. But taken together, all of these things start to help that buyer almost subconsciously form some early judgment. Does this company align with the problems I'm trying to solve? Do they seem credible? Would I stick my neck out and recommend them to my colleagues, right?
Yeah.
All very important questions any brand wants to be answering. But much of this is happening, before marketing and certainly sales really knows that buyer exists or has eyes on them. Um, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So, when that by the time that buyer is finally entering your pipeline and is getting tracked in your CRM, they're practically never starting from zero, right? They are, I think the better way to understand it is by that point, they're essentially confirming or kind of challenging maybe an opinion they already had. To put it another way, really no buyer process is going to begin with the buyer, considering every single option available to them. And that gets me to my next point, which is around this idea of shortlists that Christine talked about. Um, Buyers have a short list of companies that they've already pre-selected. Again, through this kind of nebulous, nonlinear activity that is happening before that formal buying process begins that we can see. And I think it's something we all intuitively understand. Um, and of course, there's more than just objective comparison at work here. I talked a minute ago about, the buyer's choice about recommending a solution to their buying group, to their colleagues, to their boss. And that's important because B2B purchases carry operational and financial risk, but also personal risk. At some point,
Yeah.
somebody on that buying committee has to advance an option and put their credibility behind it. And they're only going to do that if they feel confident in that choice. And that's where awareness alone is not going to cut it. It's not enough. A choice, a company has to feel credible. They have to feel relevant, but critically, they have to feel safe enough to, recommend. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about who gets on that short list. And there's a clear commercial implication here for us. A meaningful share of the demand that's available to you has effectively been determined before that visible sales process begins. And I just want to sit with that for a minute because that's kind of a bombshell when we talk about this blind spot that not only are you competing for your share of market, that share is even smaller depending on whether or not you're on that short list. So the companies that make the short list, right? They're the ones that the buyers already feel confident advancing to their buying group, which we know is common in a B2B situation. And yet, kind of every day, what Christine and I see is that B2B companies are kind of taking a passive approach to helping to build this confidence before that buying process begins.
Yeah, I hear you saying the word confidence, Edward, right? And I know from experience, confidence isn't something marketing creates on its own. Marketing can communicate your story and sales can reinforce your value, but confidence is earned through experience. It's created every time a customer interacts with your organization, every time an employee represents your company, every time a leader makes a decision that shapes how the business operates. In other words, confidence is built long before someone ever becomes a customer, which raises a really important question. If confidence is what earns a place on the buyer shortlist, where does that confidence actually come from? And that's where I'd like to spend, I think, our time, right? Where does that confidence actually come from, right? So if confidence is earned, like I said, before the buying process begins, then we need to understand how and where buyers are collecting the evidence that creates confidence. That evidence actually comes from the signals your organization sends every day. Some of those signals are intentional, your website, your marketing, your sales conversations, your thought leadership. But many of those signals, are created unintentionally. They're created by how quickly somebody responds, how clearly your people communicate, whether different departments tell the same story, whether the experience feels consistent from one interaction to the next, whether the company does what it says it will do. So those are important. Organizations are communicating constantly, whether they intend to or not. And most of that communication isn't created by marketing. It's created by the way that your organization operates. So the question is whether those signals consistently reinforce the experience you want buyers and customers and employees and partners to have, or whether they reinforce one another. And when they reinforce one another, I should say, they create confidence. And when they contradict one another, they create doubt. So over time, those accumulated signals shape what people believe about your company. This is where your brand enters the conversation, but perhaps not in the way most organizations think about it, because brand is uniquely suited to unify a leadership team, to unify an organization, to create those signals that demonstrate the consistency that's needed.
Yeah, Christine, and like let's look at those signals again from the buyer side a bit. Because whether consistent or not, those signals become that evidence that the buyer is using to shape that short list. Again, possibly not even in a conscious way, but certainly once they get into their buying process. To the market, these signals look like a company with a clear point of view, with relevant proof points, with giving relevant and credible sales conversations, and overall providing that consistent experience again at every touch point. All of these things together help the buyer answer that critical question, right? Does this company feel like the safe option? Aligning all these signals is big work, and aligning them into that consistent experience is certainly a bigger job than marketing can do alone. It really does require the story that the company as a whole tells and the experience creates really to reinforce each other, which I think brings us to a different way to potentially think about brand, right? Brand in a more commercial sense, brand as a more direct input to revenue and demand capture, things that are important to the business at large. Brand isn't just something that the company puts into the market. It's a reflection of this cumulative effect of an array of all of these signals and experiences. And that I think is why, to Christine's point, it becomes vital to aligning a leadership team.
Yeah. I would say, like, throughout my career, I've always been responsible for helping organizations grow, right? Either integrating acquisitions and, improving ops, leading people, preparing companies for transactions. And in those environments, the brand wasn't a marketing initiative. It was the North Star. And for how it was the North Star for how leadership teams aligned themselves to influence the organization for their performance. How was your organization going to perform? Brand isn't what a company says about itself. It's what people, customers, employees, partners, vendors repeatedly experience, right? Marketers generally understand that. A lot of operators don't always recognize how directly the decisions made inside the organization actually shape that experience that people are having with your business. And that's when the disconnect often begins. Leadership may be completely sincere about what it wants the organization to stand for, but intent alone does not create experience. The experience is created by the priorities leaders reinforce, the behaviors they reward, the decisions they make, and the systems that they put into place. So when those things support the stated promise, people experience the company as leadership intended. And when they don't, the organization communicates something very differently, right? So if I were to give you like two simple examples, because these are very common, leadership says we're customer focused, right? But internally, internal priorities consistently outweigh customer needs, right? You're not making the priority the customer internally. So you can say you're customer focused all you want, but customers will eventually feel that, and obviously your people, your employees understand it because they're watching these priorities, not support. We're customer focused. And then the other one that leadership teams like to say is we empower our people. But when every decision has to be escalated, employees experience something completely different. It's unintentional, right? The intent to be customer focused or to empower your people, it's there. It's just the behavior is not reinforcing it.
Yeah, and I think again, Christine's teeing up these larger issues that often get put squarely on marketing's shoulders, which I think in a lot of these conversations we're having is that marketing's role is often misunderstood and what they can and can't really affect credibly, right? Marketing can give language to what's true about the organization. They can create a story. It can help the right buyers recognize your value, but it can't compensate for an experience that immediately contradicts or is just otherwise inconsistent with really the experience that the entire organization is providing. It can't hide those things. Um, when the market narrative that you're putting out there and kind of the operating reality reinforce each other, it's great. The company becomes clearer, more credible, easier to trust, right? And that is where brand can be this unifying force and really be aligned very closely with commercial value. Not by manufacturing demand, which is not a credible claim for anybody practicing brand, but brand as an ability to improve those conditions under which you can win the demand again that is available to you by being that trusted choice when that buying process begins. Christine, can you take us a little bit more in kind of the operating side of that?
Yeah. So this may be the single most important idea we share today, right? Throughout my career, like I said, I've worked with organizations that generally want to create these great customer experiences. They want to build strong cultures and grow exceptional businesses. And none of them set out to create confusion or inconsistency, yet many of them were unintentionally doing exactly that. And the reason why is because organizations really are really judged by their intentions, right? So I shared the examples earlier. It's just when you make the promise, that's not where you stop. You're judged by the experiences you create. So what are the actions that are coming from those promises? That's what you communicate. That's how you're communicating. Your operations are communicating experiences to your prospects and to even your current customers. Over time, those experiences become the reputation that people associate with your company.
And again, I'll come back with the clear kind of commercial outcome of that internal alignment. For buyers, that operational consistency and coherence ultimately plays a role of reducing uncertainty, which is really what we've been talking about all along
Yeah.
with basically risk avoidance. Um, a consistent organization feels easier to trust. Again, this is stuff that's very intuitive, and I think I can give our partners credit, say it's easier said than done. But on the other hand, a fragmented organization creates friction, right? It provides unclear, murky answers, contradictory answers. It creates shifting expectations depending on who the customer is interacting with on a given day, or just generally kind of proof that doesn't add up to that promise that is being made. So again, this is not merely kind of just an internal efficiency issue. It is a revenue variable. It is describing whether a buyer is likely to include your company or advance you and ultimately choose you. But here's, I guess, the tricky part, right? The fragmentation that Christine's talking about rarely begins with kind of obvious dysfunction, fisticuffs in the boardroom. More often, it sort of begins with something much subtler.
Yeah, and I call that drift. This is probably my favorite word in the entire presentation because when people like hear the phrase leadership misalignment, they often imagine that conflict, right? They imagine what you were talking about, right? Picture executives arguing in the boardroom or leaders pulling in opposite directions, but that's actually not what I see most often. What I see is drift, and drift is much more subtle, right? It happens when good leaders begin making reasonable decisions without a shared reference point. No one's trying to undermine the strategy. No one is unintentionally working against the business. In fact, everyone believes they're doing the right thing, and that's what kind of makes drift really difficult to recognize. It doesn't happen all at once. You tend to notice that you have a problem once it's spiraled to some extent. But it happens with one exception to the strategy, one priority that moves ahead of another, one customer request that seems important but it isn't aligned, an opportunity that's too good to pass up but deviates sort of from the plan that you have in place for how you want to move your company from where it is right now to where you want it to be. One meeting where a decision gets made that isn't fully understood by everyone who has to execute it. Individually, none of those decisions seem significant, right? Collectively, though, they begin to change how the organization operates. Eventually, sales is making decisions based on one definition of success, and that's different than how operations is trying to operationalize for another, right? Marketing is reinforcing a completely different set of priorities, and your customer success team is picking and choosing based on who they have relationships with between sales and ops and marketing, right? So leadership still believes everyone is executing the same strategy because you're still talking about it similarly, but each team has slowly developed its own version of what success looks like, and that's drift. And the longer it goes unnoticed, the harder it becomes to correct. And everyone can really because you can really point to like, well, that seemed like a good decision in the time. It's not about whether or not you're making a good decision. You have to have decision criteria.
Yeah, and sort of going back to the buyer's perspective, they don't experience this as organizational drift. They experience changing expectations. They experience uneven proof points. They experience a company that just feels less focused and predictable. From the outside, drift just looks like inconsistency. And that inconsistency makes confidence harder for them to build and ultimately more expensive for you to earn. And inside the company, while we're talking about the dollars and cents cost of that, drift creates yet another cost.
Yeah, so this is where drift stops being sort of a leadership conversation and starts becoming a business performance conversation because drift has a cost. It shows up everywhere. So projects get repeated because teams weren't working from the same understanding, or meetings multiply because leaders are trying to reconnect people who have unintentionally drifted apart. Approvals increase because trust in decision making begins to erode. People hesitate because they're no longer confident in what success looks like. They become protective of their role or their position, their livelihood. Strong leaders become bottlenecks because every important decision finds its way back to them. Customers begin to have different experiences depending upon who they interact with. And the organization starts working harder to achieve the same result. Eventually, revenue becomes more expensive to generate. Retention becomes more difficult for both employees and customers. Margins begin to shrink because you're being forced to discount. And what's interesting is that none of those outcomes usually feel connected to one another. They don't. Operations experiences them as separate problems, but often they're symptoms of the same underlying issue, and they're paying what for like a hidden tax is how we talk about it on drift, and it's really a result typically from leadership misalignment.
And then when we look at how organizations try to correct this, there's this sort of instinctive response. Which maybe even feels familiar to you all, right? We add more process. We try to stand up another dashboard, implement another report, or put into place another approval step. But complexity rarely solves complexity, and process on its own is no substitute for strategic clarity. So having that shared understanding of direction, of priorities, of decision criteria, it improves that execution internally, but it also reduces the friction that buyers encounter as they're trying to develop that understanding of who you are and whether to include you. So, you know, now that we're connecting this kind of leadership level alignment with the actual market outcomes, with revenue, and this is kind of how our conversations about the role of brand reach the C-suite, right, Christine?
Yeah, yeah. So that's right. So a CEO I was working with actually recently asked me a question that I hear surprisingly often, and that what he said was, "Do I have the right people?" I get asked this all the time, and it's an important question, but sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes you don't have the right people, but more often, um, it's it's a decision problem, right? When I hear the question, I usually challenge the assumption behind it, right? Because I believe the real issue is rarely talent, capability, or experience of the people on your team. But it's always about how decisions are being made across the teams, leaders, and moments. And that's where I would start any assessment about whether or not you think you have the right people, right? You might not have the right people, but if you don't, but you won't know that until you fix the environment around them, or maybe better, until you give them, better said, like a clear plan to operate from. So good people can only make consistently good decisions when leadership creates consistent decision criteria, as Edward was mentioning earlier. When leaders aren't operating from the same understanding of what matters, what success looks like, or how decisions should be made, everyone starts making the best decision they can with the information that they have. Nobody's trying to work against the strategy. They're trying to support it. They're just supporting different versions of it. And that's when that drift actually begins.
And this distinction in priorities really matters because when you have different interpretations, they produce different commercial behaviors, right? One conversation might feel strategic, another might feel transactional. One team is emphasizing, one priority that another team is sort of quietly abandoning. Um, your buyer is not going to investigate why they are feeling this inconsistency. They're just going to find a company that feels that, they're gonna see you as a company that's harder to read and less predictable, and therefore less, riskier to advance. They're gonna move on, right? I think Christine's got an example she's going to share that really shows, how kind of a on the surface pretty reasonable opportunity exposes this drift issue pretty quickly.
Yeah, thanks for teeing that up, Edward. So we worked with a company that received an opportunity to pursue a large international RFP. And on paper, it looked exciting. It was a recognized brand, a significant contract, the kind of opportunity that immediately gets everyone's attention. There was just one problem, right? So it was larger than the organization was built to deliver. And it was in a geographic location where they had very little operational presence. And maybe most importantly, it wasn't consistent with the company's stated growth strategy. But when something that size appears, it's hard to ignore, right? Sales saw revenue, marketing saw visibility, leadership saw possibility. Operations immediately started to try to figure out how they were going to make this work. And for several weeks, the organization shifted into response mode. People delayed other priorities, and resources were being reassigned. And meetings were, obviously meetings and meetings and meetings to align on how they were going to respond. Marketing changed its focus to align with how they thought they needed to show up for this RFP, and sales was obviously pushing for it, and everyone worked really, really hard. Now, here's the important part. Nothing about that decision was irrational, right? Sales wanted to win the business. Everybody saw the opportunity in this RFP, and individually, those opportunities were real for each of those teams. But the one decision that they didn't measure it against was not the question of whether we should pursue this, but does this move us closer to the company we're trying to become? And the answer to that was no. And saying no to something like this is actually what I call strategic discipline. Instead, the company unintentionally it taught itself something much more powerful. It taught itself that the plan was optional, that their plan that they were going after, the brand and what it stood for, where they were trying to take the company from A to B, all of that work that they put in, it's optional because the strategy can be overridden by something that's exciting. I call it the shiny penny. And once people begin to believe that the plan is optional, they stop using it to make decisions. And this is more drift. Drift is not dramatic, it's subtle, and it happens one reasonable decision at a time until eventually everyone believes they're supporting the strategy while actually they're moving in different directions.
That's sweet. And Christine, am I sounding like a broken record when I say, yet again, there is a direct commercial impact here, right?
Yeah.
Not every available opportunity is winnable, and not every winnable opportunity is strategically valuable. In our work, we focus our partners a lot around this, around the idea, we call it right to win. And we focus on this because what it provides is some discipline around distinguishing between revenue that advances a strategy and revenue that potentially distracts or detracts from that strategy. And that discipline also protects the experience that the company can reliably deliver, which again brings us to that customer's view of the business as a whole. Um, we've sort of danced around this, but I think it's worth really putting a finer point on here. It's a fairly obvious point that organizations still manage to overlook despite all the talent in the room. Customers do not evaluate marketing, sales, and implementation and support and billing and operations as separate entities, even though internally all of those silos have their own KPIs and leadership and goals. Right? It's a fundamental mismatch between supplier side and demand side. Your buyers are evaluating one company, one experience, and in many cases, one impression, right? They expect that promise that was made during the sales process to carry through implementation, right? They expect support to understand the context and for billing to reflect the same level of professionalism that their sales and implementation team provided. Again, of course, your team may be organized by function, but preference, the commercially valuable thing we're chasing here, the way we can influence some of these decisions, preference is shaped across the full experience, right? So those things are at odds. There needs to be a correction there. Any weak handoff or any contradictory message that doesn't remain contained within it, it doesn't stay in one department. It spreads and it changes ultimately how the customer judges the company.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why leadership alignment across the business matters. Even when every function is operating from the same strategy, customers experience the consistency, right? When they are aligned, and when they're not, customers begin to notice those little things. And individually, like I said, those moments, they seem really small, but collectively they shape how people feel about doing business with the organization. And that's why I believe the brand isn't built in a single campaign. It's built in 1,000 moments when an organization either delivers a consistent experience or it doesn't. And that's why leadership alignment matters so much, because leaders don't just shape business performance, they shape the experience that every department creates and ultimately the experience every customer remembers with the decisions and the direction of each member of the leadership team.
Sorry, jump the gun there. Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's
Um,
okay.
itchy trigger finger. Okay. Um, let's talk a little bit about this idea of preference because I think this is an idea I'd love for you all to take away that I think will help you frame up the strategic approach to influencing that buyer behavior, before they become active. So that, again, when they do begin that buying process, when they do show up on your dashboard or in your funnel, you begin with an advantage. You begin with that shortlist advantage. You're better positioned to capture the demand that you can win, right? And I think key to understanding this is that buyers aren't looking for a perfect solution. And if not that, they don't have time to find a perfect solution. They are looking for enough confidence to move a decision forward because of the pressures that they are under. They need confidence that your company understands the situation they're in. They need confidence that your claims are supported by proof. They need confidence that the experience after the sale is going to be consistent with the experience before it. And ultimately, they need confidence that recognize that, recommending you is not going to create unnecessary risk for them, right? At the end of the day, everybody's sort of got this self-preservation instinct, and that's
It's
sometimes
real.
easy for us to lose track of, right, Christian?
Yeah.
It's human psychology, even if it's couched in the complex world of B2B buying. Um, you know, if this short list is the set of companies that a buyer is already considering kind of as credible and safe enough to advance, there's another layer to this because within that short list, there's a hierarchy. We were just looking at some research from Forrester, and it was showing that not only do most B2B buyers start with a short list, and by most I mean like almost all, in almost 80% of the deals, the number one choice on that short list won the deal, right? So capturing the advantage that we're talking about in this commercial sense means influencing buyer preference. And preference, again, becomes valuable financially and from an alignment perspective because that formal buying process doesn't create that confidence from scratch, right? More often, as I said, it's confirming or strengthening or potentially weakening what the buyer already believes and who they want to choose, who they prefer.
Yeah. And this is just continuing more evidence for why leadership alignment really matters so much because leadership begins creating those conditions long before buyers know they're even buying. Every decision leaders make influences how employees make decisions, and those employee decisions shape customer experiences. And those experiences either reinforce confidence or slowly diminish it. Over time, consistency becomes confidence. Confidence becomes trust, and trust becomes preference. And preference is what earns you a place on the buyer's shortlist. So that's why, from our perspective, brand isn't simply something organizations communicate, it's something they earn through the experiences they constantly create. Every leadership decision is an opportunity to strengthen that experience or unintentionally weaken it. And over time, those moments compound. And that's how organizations become the company's buyers prefer before the buying process even begins.
Christine, I like to think we've done a pretty good job of connecting some of these leadership decisions to, how buyers are performing preference and kind of ultimately making decisions. So connecting kind of operational logic with commercial impact. But kind of getting back onto your side of things, from an operator's perspective, right? What separates the companies that kind of are good, that actually are able to sustain this alignment, and kind of line all these things up to actually drive growth?
Yeah, I would say, I've spent a lot of years doing this, primarily in PE-owned environments, so around a lot of acquisitions and integrations and turnarounds and periods of really significant growth, right? That's the perspective that I bring my answer to you from, right? But one of the clearest things that I would say is that the strongest companies don't necessarily have better strategies. They're not smarter, they're not more experienced, because most companies actually have pretty intelligent people and a reasonable plan. The difference is whether leadership can turn that plan into a shared way of operating. Can they inspire? Do your leaders even agree on what matters most? And so when you're in environments where you have high growth, you have lots of new people coming in, when you have M&A, you have mixes of people who are very strongly preferred in where they grew up and how things operate, and to some extent protective of the brand as their individual brands as they merge. There is a lot of room for just deviation, and people need a North Star. So strategy sitting in a presentation doesn't create that consistency, right? Do your employees understand how the strategy should influence the decisions they make every day? That's a basic question I think that leadership teams can start with to try to understand how they're aligned. You can actually survey your folks and ask a number of these questions to really get a good feel of where your alignment factor is on, right? So when that happens, when leadership creates that consistency by repeatedly reinforcing the strategy through its decisions, priorities, and behaviors. So again, not the presentation in the town hall, but actually the day-to-day. Then, what happens is people don't have to improvise as often, right? If those decisions and priorities and behaviors are consistent with that town hall message. So they don't need to escalate decisions all the time. They move with greater clarity and confidence because they have a shared reference point for what the company's trying to accomplish. Everybody's sort of in the boat together and you're rowing in the same direction. And that's what leadership alignment makes possible. It turns strategy into that consistent execution, where that consistent execution becomes experience. Employees experience it, current customers experience it, prospective buyers experience it, and the market may never see the leadership alignment behind the company, but it absolutely experiences the result. And this is where growth comes from, that inspiration, that cohesiveness that the alignment creates.
And again, taking the view from outside of the company, from the buyer's perspective, the outcome of all that work and alignment that Christine's talking about for a buyer feels like clarity. It feels like
Yeah.
credibility. It feels like confidence. So that is sort of how we connect, the operating system within the company and ultimately preference in the market. They are intrinsically linked. So when Christine talked about the two of us kind of orbiting the same problem, that's what you meant.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So just some final thoughts here. So we sort of began today with an idea that sometimes a company doesn't lose the sale. It never becomes a serious option in the first place. But by the time the buyer enters the formal buying process, they have already formed an opinion about which company feels credible, relevant, safe enough to consider, right? That confidence is built over time through the signals and experiences the organization consistently creates. And those experiences begin inside the business, and they begin with with what the leadership prioritizes, what leadership rewards, and how leadership makes decisions, and whether the people across your organization are operating from that same understanding, or where the company is going and what matters most, right? All of these things are important. When leadership is aligned, the organization is more likely to communicate clearly, operate consistently, and deliver on its promises. That consistency creates confidence, confidence creates trust, trust creates preference, and preference is what earns a company a place on the buyer's shortlist. So whether we intend to or not, leadership is shaping the brand every day, not simply through what the company says, but through employees and customers and buyers, what they are repeatedly experiencing. So the question for every leadership team really is, are we creating that experience intentionally, or are we allowing it to emerge accidentally through thousands of disconnected decisions?
And because your buyers are forming those opinions well before they are officially starting that buying process, the critical work of shaping this preference and earning this preference has to begin earlier too. It has to begin higher up in the organization, and it has to begin across the organization, right? It begins, with this idea, we love it, the clear right to win, an organization capable of delivering it, and the experience ultimately that's giving those buyers that reason to believe.
Yeah. So at R plus M, we believe the brand is much bigger than marketing. Brand is the experience an organization creates through the way that it leads and operates and communicates and delivers. And as I shared when we began, Edward and I approached this work from two connected different sides of the business. And together, our work is about closing the gap between what a company says about itself and what its employees and customers and partners and buyers actually experience using brand. Because when leadership and ops and marketing and customer experience are all aligned around the brand, companies are better positioned to earn that confidence, to create preference and grow. So we'd now like to open up the conversation for any questions. Also, there's a QR code here if you'd like to set up some one-on-one time to talk with Edward. I'm going to share a link to my calendar, and I'll open up a few slots when we send out the recording. So